The moon in the second house is a very interesting placement. And to understand it, we should begin by reviewing what the second house represents. Here it is. The second house is the area of sky that is directly below the eastern horizon. That's the basis for everything that it symbolizes. It's below the eastern horizon, so it symbolizes everything that supports whatever the eastern horizon represents. What happens in the east? The sun rises. So the second house supports sunrise. What is sunrise all about? Sunrise is the start of the day. So supporting the sunrise means supporting the start of things, supporting the birth of things, supporting the creation of things. This is why it is the house of foundations. The support of the building is its foundation. The thing that something else is built upon is the second house. And the thing that you build something else upon really affects the stability of the thing that you build. And that's why the second house is very crucial for understanding the stability of things. If you ask yourself, what am I built upon? Practically, you would probably, hopefully, remember your mom. Because you come from your mom, right? So this is why the second house represents your parents and your family. Not only are you're the foundation of your birth, but also they're the people that support you. So the second house has to do with the family and all sorts of supporters and friends. And you may also think, what allows me to perform any of the endeavors that I want to do? Then you would probably remember your wallet or your bank account. And so the second house represents wealth as well. All of the assets that we have that enable us to do other things, including our health. Now, when the sun rises, it starts the day, and what happens? Things come to light. We see things more clearly when the sun comes out. So the second house, therefore, is pro-visibility in everything that it represents. This is why it's a house of knowledge. Knowledge means increasing your awareness of what you're seeing. And this is why it's the house of realism and practicality, because it likes things that become more clear, more realistic, more tangible, more definable. That is a good summary of what the second house represents. Before we move on and talk about what the moon represents in the second house, let us first quickly review what the moon represents. When we think of the moon, we think of three qualities. It comes out at night. It's the king of the nighttime world. It's very bright compared to the night, which makes it very complicated because it's a night planet, but bright. And that is also its third quality, is that it is dichotomous or changing or fluid. It's not really one thing or the other. Is it bright or is it night? Well, it's kind of both. So it's night, bright, and changing. These three are the basic things that all of the symbolism of the moon is based upon. So because the moon is so changeable and fluid, it is the planet which symbolizes fluctuation, cycles, rhythms. And because the moon is so bright, it's the planet that represents beauty. Now, because it's the planet of night, the moon therefore has to do with things which are not seen, which seems at odds with the fact that it's bright. But this means it illuminates the things which are unseen. That's the nature of the moon. So it has to do with private things, things that we experience, but we experience them in private. So the moon has a shy quality to it. It has a personal quality to it. Things that are not exposed to the whole world. Things that are kept private or personal. Things that are domestic within the home. And therefore the moon's nature is feminine, because feminine nature is internal. The sexual organ of the female goes in. Now, on that theme of unseen being equal to internal, the moon, being the planet of the night, also represents things which are internal. It's not unreal, but it's internal. And so the internal aspect of our self, which is our mind, not exactly the intellectual functions within ourselves, but our emotional functions. So the moon is the planet of emotions, and our emotions are based on whether or not we are fulfilling our desires. So the moon represents desires, and our desires are based on our opinions. What we think is good, what we think is bad, what we think is desirable and undesirable. So the moon is the planet of opinions, and this is why it's a subjective, biased planet. One final thing about the moon, which is very interesting, it's nighttimey, so it's internal and unseen, so it's feminine, but it's bright. So feminine brightness is beauty, but also brightness indicates authority or dominance over other things. So the moon also represents authority and dominance, but in a feminine way. So it represents the female authority, which is archetypically described as the mother. Now that we took the time to review what the moon and the second house represents, we can put them both on the same page and figure out what the moon symbolizes when it goes into the second house. So first of all, the moon signifies fluctuation and change, but the second house is about foundation and stability. So this is a clash. So if the moon is in the second house, it represents big changes. Changes often happening. Significant changes. Secondly, the moon is all about opinions, which means my subjective viewpoint and my bias. But the second house likes things that are objectively clear. So the moon is subjective and the second house is objective, and that's a clash. So when the moon is in the second house, we get people who their objective world is very subjective. So they get into fantasies, they get very into imagination. They get very bored by practical things, or they have low regard for tangible things. Thirdly, the moon is the unseen night planet, but it's very bright. So it's an unseen bright planet, so it's like unseen, but the second house is about supporting the sunrise, right? So it's pro-visibility. So this is another clash, but it's actually not quite a clash because the moon is also so bright. So it's a very complex relationship. The moon is unseen bright, and the second house likes things that are bright because it likes sunrise. So when the moon is in the second house, people are famous for being invisible, famous for not being too visible, famous for not being too materialistic, etc. Now, let's take this concept of the moon in the second house and compare it with three people with known documented, well-documented birth times who are well known. With the moon in the second house, Rene Guenon, Walt Disney, and Sadhguru. So how about on this first thing of changing often and significantly? Rene Guenon was like a constant changer of religion. Always changing his religion. I mean, very dramatically changing religions. Sampling from all the religions, fluctuating between them, trying to make them all integrated into one thing. Walt Disney, how does this constant change or these big changes? His childhood is extremely different from his adulthood. And his childhood was very child negative, and his adulthood was very child positive. Sadhguru, very different life before his enlightenment and after his enlightenment. Non-vegetarian, vegetarian, and so forth and so on. So you can see three practical examples of the moon in the second house representing a life that has like constant change or a lot of change or important changes to it. The second point was the clash between subjectivity and objectivity. So the interpretation is these people are really into fantasy or imagination, and they're a little bit bored by conventional material things. Rene Guenon, super, of course, he's the metaphysics. Metaphysics is his big thing. He always talks about metaphysics and spirituality. He's in his imagination and creativity and bored with conventional worldly things. Walt Disney, imagine, believe. Those are his big slogans. Believe, imagine. Sadhguru, what's his thing? Spirituality, spirituality, spirituality. So again, here you can see three concrete examples of the clash between subjectivity of the moon and objectivity of the second house, producing a person that's not very thrilled with objective things and is way more interested in subjective things, fantasy, illusion, perception, spirituality, so forth, philosophy. The third point, famous for being invisible, or famously invisible, or famous for their invisibility, or famous about things which are not visible, tangible things. We'll get a better concrete idea of this by looking at these three examples. Rene Guenon, what's he famous for? Is he famous for how beautiful his face is? Is he famous for how many cars he has, or how much money he made, or what inventing the light bulb? He's famous for his ideas about spirituality. So he's famous for these intangible things. Walt Disney, what's he famous for? He's famous for creating fantasy stories and fantasy characters and helping people to believe and imagine. What's Sadhguru famous for? Famous for his ideas, famous for his spirituality. So now you get a concrete concept of what we mean by the moon in the second house, indicating a person who is famous for invisible things. Visible for invisible things. But there's something about each one of these three that doesn't really seem to be connected to the moon in the second house, but is quite significant in their individual lives. For example, Rene Guenon is very ill, has very poor health. Walt Disney, he's very wealthy and very artistic. And Sadhguru is very wealthy also and very powerful, like very influential, very dominant, very commanding. But that doesn't seem to have anything to do with this moon in the second house. So let's take a look at their individual charts to see what's going on those topics. Does the moon in the second house play any role whatsoever in the ill health of Rene Guenon? Well, no, actually it should be the opposite. Theoretically, speaking as a theoretical astrologer, we would say no, it should have been the opposite, because the moon represents the mother, the creator of the body, therefore it represents health and beauty, and the second house represents the mother, the father, the creator of the birth. So why should Rene Guenon have terrible health when he has the moon in the second house? Well, first thing I want to bring to your attention is, if something is very important to health, then things which affect it have a direct effect upon health. So since the moon in the second house is pretty important to health, if there are negative effects on that moon, they will directly affect the health. When you talk about health, the areas that draw your attention are the second house, the house of health, the sixth house, the house of illness, the eighth house, the house of our vitality, and the 12th house, the house of our anti-vitality, right? The house of our fatigue. And the planet representing health is the sun. So let's look at how these factors are playing out in Rene Guenon's chart. He has the 8th Lord in the second house with the second Lord in bad dignity. The second house itself is being affected by the 8th Lord, and the second Lord is also being affected by the 8th Lord, and the 8th Lord is not in a happy condition because it's in a sign that it doesn't like, with the ruler of that sign that it doesn't like. Secondly is that the 6th Lord aspects that whole thing. The 6th Lord is aspecting the first and second house and the second Lord. And you might say, but that's exalted 6th Lord, but it's on a very difficult degree. It's in Sandhi. It's on 0 degrees. Finally, when you take a look at the sun is in the house of illness, the 6th house, which could be okay, but it's there with the 12th Lord, the Lord of fatigue. So all things considered, this is the chart of a person who has significant health problems. Is it because they have the moon in the second? Not really. The next question that we had was Walt Disney. Why is he so artistic? Is the moon in the second house artistic? Not necessarily artistic, but the moon in the second house really loves imagination. And now think about Walt Disney. Is he Picasso? He's not Picasso, but he is very good with imagination, and he draws pictures well enough to convey his ideas. So when you think about art, you should draw your attention to these places: the 3rd house, the 5th house, and the 11th house, as well as the moon and Venus. If we look at these in his chart, his moon is in the 2nd house, which we talked about, but what sign is it in? It's in Libra, an artistic sign, Venus's sign. His Venus is where? In the 5th house, an artistic house, and while it is there, it is with the 7th and 4th lords, so it is in Raja Yoga, which means it's very powerful there. So the very artistic planet Venus is in the very artistic 5th house in a very powerful combination. His 1st lord, furthermore, is in the 3rd house, which means he likes to draw, likes to use his hands. And his 3rd lord is in the 5th house, which means he doesn't just like to write or use tools with his hands or play sports with his hands. He likes to do artistic things with his hands. And his 5th lord is in the 5th house, means his 5th house, creative house, is blessed in Raja Yoga. So it is really not hard to see at all that this is a very artistic person that is very imagination driven. So in other words, does the moon in the 2nd house make you very artistic? No, but it makes you very imaginative. And then if you have a chart like Walt Disney where you also are very artistic, then you will express your imagination very effectively through art. Another thing about Walt Disney is that he's was incredibly wealthy. So does the moon in the 2nd house make you incredibly wealthy? It doesn't go against it, right? The moon is about wanting things, and the 2nd is about having things. So wanting plus having equals finding. So, you know, the moon in the 2nd house is not necessarily an indication of wealth, but it's not wealth negative. It's wealth positive, wealth favorable. What are the important points related to wealth? 2nd house and 11th house. Those are the positive indications. And 12th and 6th are negative for wealth. But when it comes to wealth, you just want to see negative meaning outflow or expense, and positive meaning income. But you can't make income without making expense. So even the negative financial houses are positively important in a chart. Anyway, let's look at what he's got. He's got the 1st lord in the 2nd house. Well, the 2nd house is important for wealth, and the 1st lord is the most important lord. But more importantly, the 2nd lord and the 6th lord are both in Raja Yoga. Both of them are in Raja Yoga. So does the moon in the 2nd house make you wealthy? No, but if it's in a chart like this where there's other things that indicate wealth, then certainly the moon in the 2nd house helps. Sadhguru is also very, very wealthy. So for Sadhguru, his 11th lord is in the 11th house with the 1st lord. Oof. And that 11th lord is also the 6th lord. We said the 11th house is important, the 6th house is important. The 11th and the 6th lord are in the 11th house with the 1st lord, making them very important. We said the 2nd house is important for wealth. His moon is in his 2nd house, and his 2nd lord is in his 1st house. We said the 12th and the 2nd lords and houses are very important. So his 12th lord is in 2 Raja Yogas. It's like Walt Disney. Now, Sadhguru has another quality that seems very interesting, is that he's fairly dominant. He's very dominating and commanding. When he walks in, you notice it. And it's not just because people have nominated him to be the guru. He has its natural sense of command. Is that part of what it means to have the moon in the 2nd house? Sort of. The moon in the 2nd house does support being a prominent or a dominant individual. But it isn't really on itself enough to indicate a person who really is very prominent, like Sadhguru. So what else is going on? With this quality of being very, very commanding or very dominant, you would look at the 10th house and the sun. So what's going on in his case? Well, he has the 10th Lord in the 10th house with the 9th Lord and the 5th Lord. So he's got two Raja Yogas in his 10th house with the 10th Lord in his 10th house. If you look carefully at his 10th house, it's so masculine. But it's very intellectually masculine. Why is it so masculine? It's because he's the Sun and Mars in the 10th house. That's masculine. Masculine means, like Sadhguru, commanding, dominant. You must obey. But it's his dominance is not brutal or barbaric. It's very intellectually dominant. Because it's Virgo, and the 10th Lord Mercury, the Lord of Intelligence, the planet of intelligence, is here. Finally, the other planet which is important for the dominance factor is the Sun itself, and there it is, right there in the 10th house. So does this moon in the 2nd house indicate a very dominant, commanding person? Not in and of itself, although it's not antagonistic towards that interpretation. The reason why Sadhguru is so commanding is because of his 10th house. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.